Hello there, I'm Reverend Nhien, founder of Evolving Enneagram. If you've been seeking a compassion-based, contemplative approach to Enneagram inner work, you are certainly in the right place. We are in the midst of a 52-week Sunday talk series based on the book by Oren Sofer, Your Heart Was Made for This. This week, the topic is integrity, and the title of my talk is Living an Undivided Life, the Law of Three. So today, we're not going to be talking at all really about the Enneagram personality types. So if you've been journeying with us at Evolving Enneagram for any time now, you know that the Enneagram is so much more than just a personality or typology system. The Enneagram, it has ancient roots, and the Enneagram symbol reaches back into antiquity and is a profound and dynamic symbol of life itself, of consciousness, of our wholeness. And so today I want to focus on the Enneagram as a map of consciousness, and in particular, a mandala of wholeness. And we'll focus on the law of three. So we're going to do this in three parts. I want to begin by talking about the meaning of integrity, just as I define it, as I'm talking about it today, and integrity in particular as living an undivided life, a life of wholeness. And then in part two, I'd like to address the idea that wholeness is not just individual, but communal, right? So there's an element of unity in wholeness. And then in the final section, part three, I want to address the law of three, which is represented by the inner triangle. So you might want to take a look at one of your Enneagram books and check out the symbol, and even meditate on that inner triangle of the Enneagram symbol. So, and we'll talk about how that inner triangle can be a path toward integration, right? Of integrity, of wholeness that is not just individual, but communal. Especially, I feel like this is especially important during these very polarized and polarizing times. So let's begin. First, integrity is about living an undivided life, a life of wholeness. And the word integrity itself comes from the Latin integer, right? Looks like integer. And that word means whole or complete. And it's defined in various dictionaries. I just grabbed one definition from Merriam-Webster, which says the quality or state of being complete or undivided. I love that, undivided. And so that leads to my second point, which is for you to consider that wholeness is not individual, but communal, right? Not just about me, but perhaps about us, about all of this. And in fact, this is a point that I make in my upcoming Enneagram of the Soul book, which is coming out. Pre-orders come out this September, so stay tuned for that. But this is a key piece to it, to talk about how this contemplative journey, it might begin with my individual problem, that, this like suffering that I seem to have. But I deeply believe that as we continue on this journey, we realize that it's not just about me. In fact, it never was about me, right? I mean, and in some ways, it's always been about me. But there's a bigger me that includes the wholeness of being. And there's this idea that I can't accept wholeness in a vacuum, right? So that's to say that I cannot accept my wholeness, I don't believe, while rejecting yours, right? It's not like a special thing that I'm whole, but you're not, right? If I want to claim this sort of intrinsic aspect of being, it's because I am one with spirit. That spirit is the very fabric of my being. That love is the very fabric of my being, that I am whole, right? And if spirit is all that is, then tag, you are also it, right? So I can't accept the gift of my wholeness in a vacuum. I can't accept it while still rejecting yours. And nor can I accept our collective unity. Like I hear a lot of nines are like, yes, the unity of the world, nor can you accept your collective unity without embracing all parts of yourself as well. Like you get to be included in that wholeness and that unity. So it works both ways. One of the important pieces I feel is, again, no one ever has to agree with everything I say to be part of our community, but I do believe that spirit is the allness of being, that is all that is. And spirit being all that is, whether you call it God or the universe or truth or reality or divine light, that the necessity of it being the allness of life is that it is fundamentally indivisible. And when I say that, what I mean is that it can appear to be divided, but it is fundamentally indivisible. And perhaps the same is true of me individually, quote, inside of me, right? All parts of me are indivisible, even though I would sometimes exile parts of me that I think are not acceptable, right? Same thing though with our humanity, maybe even beyond our humanity, the world, the universe. And so when I come from my egoic state, I believe in the separation rather than I believe that we are divisible. And in fact, you had divided from me, right? As opposed to really leaning into a sense of the inherent indivisibility of things and how, depending on how we hold life, how we hold our inner life, as well as the life of the world, and I would say of the political world and landscape right now, that, or for some of us, it's also, it can feel like it's like man versus the environment, right? Like this kind of separation between humanity and the natural world, but instead holding it as this indivisible whole. So Parker Palmer, one of my favorite authors, in his book, A Hidden Wholeness, The Journey Toward an Undivided Life, wrote this, oh, love this. Just as an aside, I often teach about the Enneagram as sitting in 9 different circles. So you'll know like how poignant this description is for me, because he's not talking about the Enneagram. He writes, we can put the chairs in a circle, but as long as they are occupied by people who have an inner hierarchy, the circle itself will have a divided life. One more form of living within the lie, a false community. As long as they are occupied by people who have an inner hierarchy, the circle itself will have a divided life. I think of that in terms of the circle of the Enneagram and of my individual wholeness, because the Enneagram helps us to see our inner hierarchy in so many ways. Like within ourselves, we see repression of certain centers of intelligence. We see the Enneagram of ego ideal, on the surface, and the ego avoidance being shut down. And I've addressed that in past talks. You can go back and listen to those. We see preferences for certain conflict styles being up there, better, certain social styles, and then certain ones being, lower down in that hierarchy. So the list goes on within ourselves. And then, of course, as we approach the world, we might have some sense based on race, conscious or unconscious, right? Class hierarchy, divisions, right? Nationality, like America being superior to others, and of course the list goes on in that as well. So let's consider how this inner work we do deeply supports or can support living an undivided existence or coexistence, right? So that leads us to my third and final point, which is the law of 3. I want to talk about how the law of 3 helps us to embody individual and collective wholeness. I'll start with the how the law of 3 is applied in somatic Enneagram work, in our inner work, and then draw an analogy to that, to how we can apply it to what we are experiencing in our lives in the world. It doesn't have to be politics, but that's really fresh on my mind today. Like it could just be a relationship conflict, right? So Gurdjieff, who basically brought the Enneagram to the modern world, the three forces taught by Gurdjieff, symbolized by that inner triangle of 3 points, are the affirming, sometimes called the wholly affirming, denying, wholly denying, and wholly reconciling, reconciling or wholly reconciling forces, affirming, denying, and reconciling forces. So you can also think of it as the affirming as like, this is the active, or this is what is wanted, and this is kind of what seems to be opposing it, what seems to be in the way. And it's different depending on what your perspective is, right? Someone else might think they're affirming forces, you're a denying force, right? And vice versa. So I want to plant that seed of this affirming, denying, and reconciling forces, and then jump to somatic Enneagram framework, and then come back to affirming, denying, and reconciling. But let's jump to the somatic Enneagram framework to give credit where it's due. This is as taught by my teacher, Oren Gilbert, in her somatic Enneagram trainings. And I am certified in somatic Enneagram work. So vis-a-vis the somatic approach to the Enneagram, Marianne teaches that there is this receptivity as a force. You can say that that's the welcoming yes, that's the positive. Reactivity, oh no, like whoa, force. And then integration is the third force, right? And integration then or it's kind of like what happens when we bring grounded presence, and that isn't something we force to have happen, right? But what naturally spontaneously occurs when the receptive and the reactive forces are held together in balance by our grounded presence. And this is so important, everyone, because you can't just hear this talk in a vacuum, right? We've been building up through practices of inner awareness, the inner observer, placement of attention. And so these capacities, along with what many of us in our community practice, which is centering prayer, a contemplative inner practice. And by no means, if you're listening to this, do you need to be practicing the same things we practice in our community. But I can't stress enough the importance of, like, this is just intellectual, or these are just ideas, that the discipline of contemplative practice helps us to embody these ideas in our lives. So that's super important. So if you're struggling, you might kind of go back to just gain some meditative practices that help you to ground yourself. So somatic Enneagram work, and then I'll say all work really, begins with grounded presence. So what happens is when we have this constriction and we have this desire to do something, right? I might even have a personal example, lifelong desire for intimacy. And so I'm like, yeah, I'm trying for intimacy, right? I'm going for it. And yet, there's this denying force, definitely, not always conscious of my fears of intimacy or my resistance to it, whether it's like a fear of rejection or fear of abandonment, or a fear of being shamed, even perhaps, that, this negating force that's there. And when we just operate from this black and white polarized thinking, it's I want it and I don't want it, and the two have to battle it out. And the law of three tells us that what seems oppositional is not, is part of the dance of creation. In her book, The Holy Trinity and the Law of Three, the rest of the title is Discovering the Radical Truth at the Heart of Christianity. But this is not just for Christians, by the way. But she draws an analogy to the Holy Trinity and that inner triangle there. She says the most liberating insight to come out of our collective work with the law of three was the realization that what appears to be the resisting or opposing force is never actually the problem to be overcome. Second force, or wholly denying, is a legitimate and essential component in every new arising. No resistance, no new arising. So it's like, instead of seeing these polar opposites as this is against me, this is actually a necessary component to something, a third, something that is wanting to be birthed, right? And so we bring in the reconciling force. In this case, in somatic work, this reconciling force can be seen as as our awareness, our grounded presence, right? So we bring awareness, and eventually the awareness somatically, we might feel somatically, touching my belly here, in my body, you know, it's like, oh, here's my heart's desire for intimacy, and I can feel it as a thumping and moving outward, or heart racing, maybe, you know, and I might feel the denying force as a tightening, you know, in the belly or something like that, right? But just being aware that if I am able to gently, in letting it transpire in its own time, just bring awareness, gentle, compassionate, non-forcing awareness, grounded presence to what is arising, these energies. Eventually they often make contact, right? And then something surprises me and something new arises. And this is what I've seen in my clients as we do somatic Enneagram work. It's like a resolution, a reconciliation, an integration, a transformation that happens. And it's like, you know, it's amazing. And they didn't make it happen. Go figure, right? And that's how it works. So this happens somatically when we do somatic work. The same principle can be used when we look at the body, well, from a Christian perspective, you might call it the body of Christ, right? And we're not talking about like the literal body of like Jesus. We're talking about like the beloved community, the larger body. Right, maybe from Buddhist perspective, it's Sangha, it's the whole community, but maybe it's even bigger because from a more than human perspective, we're talking about all of life and just holding all of life in this way, right? That when we're approaching life in general, we can consider the law of three. And I want to share a few teachings by Cynthia Bourgeault. She talks about the foundational principles of the law of three. And so again, in every new arising, like when we're talking about the creative principle, right? In every new arising, there are three forces: affirming, denying, reconciling. The interweaving of the three produces a fourth in a new dimension. Remember Einstein's like famous quote, "No problem can be solved at the same level of consciousness that created it." It kind of smacks of that, like, you know, it's like a new and higher kind of energy, right? And Cynthia Bourgeault writes, like, solutions to impasses generally come by learning how to spot and mediate the third force, which is present in every situation, but generally hidden. And she adds again that the idea of third force is found in religion in the concept of the Trinity. And if you come from a different religious or spiritual background, you might also be aware of a Trinity that's different from the Christian or Catholic Trinity, but just be aware of like how many wisdom traditions can have that, right? So the key piece of this third element that we want to bring in is, as Cynthia Bourgeault teaches, it takes three independent strands of hair to make a braid, right? So it's the third strand, it's important to say, is an independent force. We're not talking about affirming and denying, affirming plus denying equals the third. We're talking about a third is introduced into the space. And the third, for our purposes, being grounded presence, maybe compassionate witnessing is another way of saying it, right? So it's subtle awareness. And so she gives some examples in case it's easier for you to understand that way. So a braid, she says, is not simply a fourth strand of hair, right? It's a whole new category of thingness. Yeah, a young bean sprout is no longer a seed, but becomes a plant, right? So seed, earth, sun equals a sprout, like it's something new. Flower, water, fire equals bread, something entirely different and new. Plaintiff, defendant, I used to be an attorney, right? Plaintiff, defendant, judge, resolution of the case as something new, something beyond any of those parts, right? And she says, I have to trust her on this one because I've never done any sailing. Sails, keel, helmsperson is the third force. Means a course made good, right? But this third element has to come into the picture. So, oh, and of course there's child, and you know how that works. Coupling, creating a third, and the third being its own entity. And for the third to then expand to another level, there needs to be another trinity, if you will, right, through the law of three. So I think I just want to end here by saying that as I was preparing today's talk, like during this afternoon, we here in the United States got big news that President Biden was withdrawing from the presidential race. This is July 21st, 2024. It feels kind of historic. So yes, I totally stopped my talk preparations to watch some news. And as I did, I was so saddened by the comments already being made on President Biden's X, or formerly Twitter, account. I'm talking about vitriol from all directions, right? That just pains me to see us on the outside being so divided, having so much hate. And so I remembered reading Cynthia Bourgeault's book on the law of three, like, I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago, and I pulled it up, and this is what I read. One can only imagine how greatly the political and religious culture wars of our era could be eased by the simple courtesy of the law of three. 1, the enemy is never the problem, but the opportunity. 2, the problem will never be solved through eliminating or silencing the opposition, but only through creating a new field of possibility large enough to hold the tension of the opposites and launch them into a new direction. Imagine what a different world it would be if these 2 simple precepts were internalized and enacted. Wow. I do not deign to have the truth or the knowledge of like what is absolutely right for our world. But the law of three, as part of what we call like the process Enneagram, might give us a process by which, if we are collectively willing to practice the contemplative practices that allow us to sense into that third force, not just be over identified with I'm the affirming clearly and you're the opposing, right? But to step back and hold the affirming, hold the opposing in this third compassionate, witnessing, grounded, loving, I would even say, presence, holding it all and seeing what spontaneously emerges as the third, as the solution that comes from another dimension of being altogether. What kind of world would we be able to live in? And so remember her words here, the enemy is never the problem, but the opportunity. Namaste.